Steam curled from the pot as Yara untied her apron. "I have a date tonight," she said. "Easy as anything. Don't wait up." Jun-woo's hand went still over the counter. He didn't move. Not for 3 full seconds. The longest silence she had ever heard out of him. Who is he? The question left him before he seemed to decide to ask it. She looked at him then, really looked, and understood for the first time that this had nothing to do with her schedule. His jaw tightened. "I don't want you to go." Why would a man who had spent 3 months keeping his distance suddenly be unable to let her walk out the door? This is the story of how he got there, and it starts long before either of them had a name for what was growing between them. 3 months earlier, Yara Faloyin could already tell you exactly how Bae Jun-woo took his coffee, though he had never once told her himself. Black, no sugar. In the plain white cup instead of the good porcelain, because, she'd worked out by her 2nd week, he hated being fussed over. She hadn't expected to notice details like that. Her first morning in the penthouse, she'd stood in a kitchen bigger than her old apartment in Houston, watching light pour through floor-to-ceiling windows onto marble she was almost afraid to season anything on, and thought, "I am absolutely going to get fired within a month." The man who owned it all had walked in at 6 in the morning, in a suit that cost more than her flight to Seoul, looked at her exactly once and said, "I don't eat breakfast before 7, before disappearing behind an office door that closed like a decision. She'd taken the job through one of the placement firms that handled Seoul's wealthiest households, the kind of position other chefs discussed with a mix of envy and warning. Good pay, excellent references, a boss who was, depending on who you asked, either brilliant or impossible. Nobody had mentioned that he barely spoke unless he had something worth saying, and that his silence, once she got used to it, wasn't cold so much as careful. He didn't waste words any more than he wasted anything else. "Don't take it personally," Bae So-yul told her that first week, catching Yara staring after him with something between irritation and bewilderment. So-yul had the settled calm of someone who'd spent years managing a man other people found unmanageable. "He's like that with everyone. Give it a month. You'll either learn to read him or you'll quit. Most people quit." "I don't quit," Yara said, and So-yul smiled like she already suspected as much. Seoul itself took longer to feel like anything but a very beautiful, very expensive layover. She spent those early weeks memorizing subway lines and mangling enough Korean to make the corner grocer laugh instead of wince, sending her sister back in Houston photos of increasingly strange snack foods with captions like, "Send help," and "Actually don't. I think I love it here." The job itself she'd decided to treat like an apprenticeship rather than a compromise, long enough to save real money and build a name for herself in kitchens outside the States, short enough that it wouldn't become the whole of her story. Private chefing wasn't the plan. It was the runway. By the time she'd started to know Bae Jun-woo as something other than the name on her contract, she'd already decided this chapter of her life was going to be one she was proud of, regardless of how it ended. She just hadn't expected him to become part of the chapter at all. She didn't quit. She cooked in that beautiful, absurd kitchen anyway, loudly, her music playing low over a speaker she'd smuggled in against the housekeeper's raised eyebrow, and within a month, the staff had stopped flinching every time she moved something an inch from where it belonged. Her first real test came 2 weeks in, when she served him dinner without asking what he wanted first, a habit from her training that some employers found presumptuous and others found refreshing. She'd made short rib she'd adapted from her grandmother's recipe, deepened with gochujang instead of the usual spice blend, a small, unauthorized experiment she'd nearly talked herself out of at the last minute. He ate in silence, the way he ate most things, and she'd almost convinced herself she'd overstepped when he finally spoke. "Make this again," he said. Not a compliment exactly, but it was the first time he'd asked her for anything beyond what the job required, and she found, a little to her own surprise, that she wanted to. Jun-woo noticed her before he meant to. He noticed that she sang under her breath when a dish was going right and muttered under her breath when it wasn't, and that both sounds, oddly, made the penthouse feel less like a hotel he happened to live in and more like somewhere people actually existed. He noticed she never once asked him for anything beyond what the job required. No angling for a photo, no fishing for a favor, none of the careful performances he usually got once people learned exactly who he was. She looked at him the way she looked at an oven that hadn't been preheated properly, mildly unimpressed, entirely unafraid. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "You're doing it again," she told him one night in October, not looking up from the pan. "Doing what?" "Standing there like you're waiting for an elevator, instead of sitting down like a person who actually lives here." He looked around, as if an excuse might be loitering somewhere in the kitchen. He didn't find one. He pulled out a chair instead, and something in his chest loosened when she didn't make it a thing, didn't perform surprise, didn't treat it like a victory. She just kept cooking, and let him stay. That was how it started, really. Not with a single moment, but with the absence of the moment he kept bracing for. The one where she'd start treating him differently once the strangeness wore off. It never came. She corrected him when he was wrong about spice levels, which was more often than a man of his resources liked to admit. She teased him, gently, about the fact that a man with 3 separate kitchens in his life had never learned to crack an egg one-handed. She existed in his house like she had every right to take up space in it, and he never told her how rare that was, how much of his adult life he'd spent surrounded by people who wanted something shaped like his money, rather than anything shaped like him. He noticed, too, the mornings she came back from an early market run, with shadows under her eyes, and insisted, every time, that she was fine. On those days, without comment, the household schedule would quietly shift. Dinner prep simplified, an extra hour folded into her morning that she never asked for, and he never explained. She caught on eventually and said nothing. The same way he said nothing, both of them fluent in a language made almost entirely of small, unacknowledged kindnesses. Im Ji-hoon noticed it before Jun-woo said a single word about it. The way his friend's calendar started leaving gaps around dinner. The way meetings that used to run until 9 somehow ended by 7:30. He didn't say anything yet. He just watched, filing it away. The way 12 years of managing Bae Jun-woo's schedule had taught him to watch everything. Yara noticed things too. She noticed that Jun-woo lingered in doorways he had no real reason to linger in, that he asked about her day in a voice that sounded almost like he wanted the actual answer, not the polite one. She told herself it was probably just what wealthy, lonely men did with the one warm thing in their orbit, attached a little too much meaning to it. She'd seen it before, with an elderly client back in Houston who'd started leaving her notes with his grocery order after his wife passed. It hadn't been about her, it had been about the silence around her, and she'd learned, that year, exactly how easy it was to mistake someone else's loneliness for something personal. She didn't let herself consider that it might be different here. Not yet. Then came the night she mentioned her grandmother. It was late, the kind of late where the kitchen belonged only to the two of them, and she was making jollof for herself. Nothing on the official menu, comfort food after a long week. She told him, without meaning to turn it into a story, about her grandmother's kitchen in Houston, about the fights her aunties used to have over who got the crispy, blackened layer at the bottom of the pot, the part everyone claimed to hate and secretly hoarded. She hadn't thought he was really listening. He'd been on his phone, or near enough to it that she assumed he was somewhere else entirely. 3 weeks later, she found a note on the counter, in handwriting so precise it looked typed. "Don't scrape the bottom of the pot tonight. Leave it for me." She stood there longer than the note deserved, turning it over as if it might say something different on the back. It didn't. But it also wasn't nothing. A man Seoul swore couldn't reliably remember half his own board members' names had remembered a throwaway story about a pot of rice, told once, weeks earlier, and had cared enough to ask for the one part of it that had actually meant something to her. She didn't know what to do with that. So she made the rice, left the bottom layer intact, and said nothing when he ate it slowly, like a man who understood exactly what he'd been given. She was still turning that night over in her mind, 3 days later, when her phone lit up with a name she hadn't seen in almost 2 years. A message that would end up changing everything, though she had no way of knowing that yet. The message was from Adaeze Nwosu, a chef Yara had staged for in New York years earlier, back when she was still learning which mistakes were fixable and which ones simply had to be lived through. Adayeze had since built a real name for herself and was now opening a flagship restaurant in Lagos, an ambitious, unapologetically West African concept she was calling Adun. She wanted Yara as founding executive chef, full creative control over half the menu, an equity stake, not just a salary. It was, in almost every way, the exact shape of the future Yara had been quietly building toward since the day she got on a plane to Seoul, the entire reason she'd taken a private chef job in a stranger's penthouse instead of grinding out 15-hour restaurant shifts under someone else's name. She had come here to save, to learn, to build a resume no one could argue with, so that when an opportunity like this arrived, she wouldn't have to ask anyone's permission to take it. She didn't tell Jun-woo, not because she was hiding it, she told herself, but because she genuinely didn't know what his reaction would mean. If he cared the way she'd started to suspect, telling him would feel like handing him a decision that wasn't his to make. If he didn't, if this was simply what a lonely, powerful man did with the person who made his house feel lived in, then telling him would mean watching him nod, wish her well, and go back to his phone, and she wasn't ready to find out which version of him was real. Instead, their life continued, and it got warmer without either of them naming it. On a rare Saturday when the household had the day off, and Jun-woo, for once, had nothing scheduled before noon, Yara announced she needed a specific dried pepper only sold at Gwangjang Market and that he was coming with her, whether his security detail liked it or not. "I have people who could send someone," he said, already reaching for his coat anyway. "I don't want someone. I want the pepper, and I want to watch you eat something you didn't personally vet in advance." He complained about the crowds and the noise, and, at one memorable point, a vendor's insistence that he try tteokbokki straight off the cart. "I own 11 restaurants," he informed her, eyeing the paper cup with deep suspicion. "None of them involve a cart." He ate it anyway. Twice. Yara laughed at him so hard she had to sit down on an overturned crate, and he didn't seem to mind being laughed at in the slightest, seemed, if anything, lighter than she'd ever seen him, a man temporarily let out of a life that fit him like a very expensive, very well-tailored cage. He made her laugh exactly once more that afternoon, dry and unexpected the way all his humor was, when a fortune teller near the market's south gate caught his sleeve and offered, for a modest fee, to tell him his future. "I already know my future," he told the woman, perfectly serious. "I have a 9 a.m. Yara laughed so hard she nearly dropped the pepper. "You don't do this," she said eventually, meaning all of it, the wandering, the noise, the lack of a schedule. "No," he agreed, "I don't." "Why not?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Because it's easier to control a life that never leaves the building," he said finally. "I learned a long time ago that the people closest to me tended to want something shaped like me, rather than something shaped like themselves. It's simpler to keep everyone at the same careful distance than work out who's actually there for you, and who's there for what you can give them." Something flickered behind his eyes as he said it. Brief, controlled, gone before she could name it. She filed it away without asking. Not everything needed an explanation on the first pass. She heard the years underneath that sentence, and didn't try to fix it. She just said, "I'm not interested in your money, Jun-woo. My salary already covers everything I need. I don't want anything else you have." Something in his face eased, like she'd said the one thing he actually needed to hear. There were quieter nights, too. Nights when neither of them had anything particular to say, and said nothing, and it was enough just to exist in the same room. One evening in November, a typhoon warning kept the city holed up indoors, rain slashing sideways against the windows, and they ended up on the same side of the kitchen island for once, close enough that her shoulder brushed his when she reached for the salt. Neither of them moved away. Neither of them mentioned it. She spent the rest of that night intensely aware of exactly 6 inches of empty air, and suspected, from the careful way he kept not quite looking at her, that he was counting the same 6 inches. Other nights ran the opposite direction. When a licensing deal collapsed publicly enough to make the business papers, He came home late and silent. The particular silence she'd learned meant something had actually cost him. She didn't ask what happened. She just made the short rib again, unprompted, and sat with him while he ate it, saying nothing useful, offering nothing but her presence, until his shoulders came down from around his ears sometime near midnight. "You didn't have to do that," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." She told him things too, that autumn, about her mother, who still asked, every single call, when Yara planned to get serious and let a man take care of her, about the particular exhaustion of being a woman people expected to be either grateful or invisible, and how she'd built her whole adult life refusing to be either. Her father had left Lagos for Houston in his 20s, with 2 suitcases and a degree nobody in Texas initially recognized, and had spent the rest of his life quietly insistent that his daughters would never let anyone else define what their qualifications were worth. Yara had absorbed the lesson so thoroughly she sometimes forgot it was a lesson at all. It simply felt like how a person was supposed to move through the world, collecting proof of her own competence the way other people collected anything else. Cooking, for her, had never just been cooking. It was the one language in which her competence was never up for debate. Nobody argued with a plate that tasted right, no matter what she looked like or where she'd come from, or how carefully or badly she pronounced anything. She'd built her whole career on that fact, quietly, one perfect dish at a time, and she wasn't about to build her whole heart on something less solid. "I'm not going to spend my life waiting to be chosen," she told him once, not quite looking at him, telling herself she wasn't thinking of him specifically. "I'd rather build something of my own and have someone choose to stand in it with me." He'd gone quiet in a way that felt, later, like the exact moment he understood what he stood to lose. It wasn't only good days. A few weeks after the market, his company held a small anniversary dinner for senior staff, and Yara oversaw the food. Technically off-duty, technically a guest, though nobody at the party seemed to have gotten that memo. One of the executive's wives handed her an empty champagne glass without looking at her twice, already turning to ask someone else where the real bar was. Yara took it without comment. She'd navigated worse rooms than this one. But she caught Jun-woo watching from across the room, his jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with the quarterly numbers, and said nothing about it, because there was nothing yet, technically, for him to defend. Im Ji-hoon saw the whole exchange too, and later, catching Jun-woo still watching the space where Yara had been standing, simply raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to do anything about that?" he asked. "Or should I put it in your calendar as a recurring problem?" Jun-woo didn't answer, which was, Ji-hoon thought, an answer. Later, passing Yara in the hallway on his way out, Ji-hoon added, more kindly, "For what it's worth, I've worked for that man 12 years. I have never once seen him rearrange a dinner meeting for anyone." He shrugged, all innocence. "Draw your own conclusions." Yara laughed it off at the time. She thought about it more than she let on. But Jun-woo didn't move, not really. The more he wanted her, the more carefully he held the line. He told himself it was discipline. Some nights it even felt that way. Clean, principled, the kind of restraint he was good at in every other part of his life. Other nights it just felt like standing very still while something he wanted walked further away. He had watched, once before, what it cost someone to fold herself into his world for love, and he was not going to do that to a woman who didn't need his world at all. Distance, he told himself, was the only honest thing he had left to give her. Yara felt the distance and read it as her answer. It was around then she understood the shift in herself. Not that she liked him, which she'd have admitted months earlier without much trouble, but that she had started, quietly and against every rule she'd set for herself, to fall in love with him. It terrified her precisely because he'd given her nothing to hold on to. No promise, no claim, just a note about a pot of rice and a habit of finding reasons to be near her. She called Adeyeze back on a Thursday night, alone on the building's rooftop garden, Seoul spread out gold and endless beneath her, and said yes. She had chosen her future. She would leave Korea on her own terms, rather than stay suspended in the maybe of a man who had never once told her what she meant to him. She told Dr. Evelyn Carter before she told anyone else. Over the past few months, Evelyn had become less a professional resource than a genuine friend, one of the only other people in Seoul who understood, without needing it explained, what it meant to build a life between two identities that other people insisted on treating as separate. They met for dinner near Evelyn's office, and Yara talked for 20 straight minutes about Lagos, about equity and creative control and the quiet vindication of a mentor believing in her enough to make it official, before Evelyn finally set down her chopsticks. "You haven't mentioned him once," she said. "That's how I know this is about him too." "It's not about him, it's about the opportunity." "I didn't ask if it was about the opportunity. I asked why a woman who talks for 20 minutes about a job offer hasn't said a single sentence about the man she's currently living 6 feet away from." Evelyn's voice stayed gentle, the way it always did, the directness never quite sharp enough to sting. "I'm not telling you to stay, Yara. I would never tell you that. I just want you to be honest with yourself about whether you're running toward Lagos or running from a question you're scared he won't answer." Yara didn't have a clean answer for that, which was its own kind of answer. "Even if it's both," Evelyn said, more softly, "you're still allowed to go. Just don't let yourself believe later that you left only because of him. You built this chance. It's yours, regardless of what he does or doesn't say." She held on to that on the walk home, and for a while, it helped. Adayeze wanted her in the test kitchen within 10 weeks, sooner if she could manage it, and their calls had already stopped being about whether Yara was coming and started being about what she'd be cooking when she got there. A menu built around dishes she'd been sketching in notebooks for years, jollof reimagined with suya spice, a pepper soup finished the way her grandmother finished everything, with too much love and not quite enough patience. Talking it through with Adayeze felt like flipping through a life that was already hers, just not yet built. In between those calls, Yara's evenings filled up with the unglamorous mechanics of leaving, comparing shipping quotes for her knife roll, working out whether her work visa needed to be formally closed or would simply lapse, drafting a resignation email to the placement firm that she kept, for reasons she didn't examine too closely, not sending. Every task she checked off made the move feel a little more real and a little less like something she could still change her mind about. Back at the penthouse, the small rituals started disappearing first. She stopped leaving the second cup out. He stopped finding reasons to come down before 8. Neither of them announced it. It simply thinned, the way things do when two people are quietly bracing for a version of life where the other one isn't in it anymore. He told himself he was giving her room to pack. She told herself he'd already moved past whatever she'd thought had been growing between them, that the last few months had mostly been her own hope, dressed up as something mutual. Neither of them said any of this out loud. If they had, they might have noticed they were describing the exact same silence from two different sides of it. The housekeeper cried a little, wrapping up the speaker Yara had never quite bothered to hide. Seoul brought her a farewell gift disguised as a practical necessity, a proper rice cooker, for wherever you end up, she said, not quite meeting Yara's eyes. Everyone in that building, it seemed, had already accepted the ending Yara herself was still trying to feel good about. One evening, setting the table out of old habit, Jun-woo stopped with a plate in his hand, staring at the chair across from his usual seat. It had been empty 4 nights running, ever since Yara started eating standing up at the counter, sorting through moving boxes instead of sitting down. He put the plate back in the cupboard instead of on the table and stood there a moment too long, understanding, with a kind of quiet dread, exactly how much of his life had rearranged itself around a chair he'd never once thought of as hers until it was empty. Im Ji-hoon watched the whole slow unraveling with the impatience of a man who had run out of subtlety. "You understand she's leaving," he said one night, no preamble, dropping into the seat across from Jun-woo's desk. "Soon. And your plan is dignified silence?" "My plan is to let her go without making it about me." "That's not restraint. That's cowardice, wearing a very nice suit." Ji-hoon leaned forward. "You keep telling yourself that saying nothing is a gift you're giving her. It isn't. It's a gift you're giving yourself, so you never have to hear her say no." She doesn't get to choose you if you never actually show up as an option. And if she doesn't choose me anyway? Jun-woo asked, quieter than before. At least this way, I'll know it wasn't because I made her. Ji-hoon studied him for a long moment. That's not nobility. That's just a more comfortable way to lose her. Jun-woo didn't answer that night, but the words stayed with him the way Ji-hoon's blunt truths always did, lodged somewhere he couldn't quite work loose. Yara, for her part, had begun to wonder if she'd invented the entire thing, the notes, the lingering, the particular quality of his attention that had felt, for a while, like being truly seen. Maybe that was simply what it looked like when a lonely man got used to having someone around. Maybe she'd built a small private romance out of the ordinary loneliness of a rich man, because some part of her had wanted it to be real, more than she'd wanted to be right about it. She was folding a sweater into a suitcase on a Tuesday when her phone buzzed. Priya, from the restaurant supply company, texting about the dinner she'd been trying to arrange for weeks. An actual date, the first one Yara had agreed to in the 3 months since she'd moved to Seoul, mostly because saying yes felt like proof she hadn't spent this whole assignment waiting on a man who would never say anything at all. She mentioned it to Jun-woo that evening on her way out, the way she might have mentioned a grocery order. I have a date tonight, she said, reaching for her coat. Don't wait up. I won't be home early. And for the first time in 3 months, Bae Jun-woo's composure broke clean in half. He'd heard the words clearly enough, 4 of them, a sentence any of his employees could have delivered without incident. I have a date tonight. Don't wait up. He'd heard almost the exact phrase once before, years ago, in a different kitchen, from a different woman, and it had meant the beginning of the end of things then too. He didn't understand why his body reacted like it was hearing it for the first time. The knife stilled in his hand. He set it down slowly, aware, distantly, that he was taking too long to say anything at all. Who is he? He heard himself ask it, and had no idea where the question came from, no professional reason to want the answer, and Yara's eyebrows lifted a fraction, the closest she ever came to open surprise. Priya set me up, someone from the supply company. She studied him. Why does that matter? It shouldn't have. That was the entire problem. All these months of telling himself it wouldn't, that it couldn't, that whatever he felt for the woman standing in his kitchen with her coat half on was a complication he had no right to create in her life. And now here he was, standing between her and the door, like his body had made a decision his mind had never authorized. It doesn't, he said, which was, in 11 years of running a company on careful, deliberate words, possibly the worst lie he had ever told. Jun-woo, she said his name, the way she rarely did, not the polite distance she used around the rest of the staff, just his name, quiet and direct. You've spent 3 months making sure there was never anything between us worth mentioning, so why does it matter who I have dinner with? He could have lied again. He was good at it, better than almost anyone, a man who negotiated for a living, but something about the quiet stillness in her face, not anger, not quite hurt, something closer to exhausted hope, made the lie feel like the one thing he couldn't afford to hand her. Every version of the sentence he'd spent months rehearsing for exactly this moment evaporated at once. Because I don't want you to go, he said. The words came out plain, stripped of the careful architecture he usually built around anything that mattered. She stared at him. Then why? She said, her voice cracking slightly on the second word, betraying 3 months of her own careful composure. Have you spent every day since October making absolutely sure I never had a reason to think that? Because I know what I am to you on paper. He made himself keep going, even as every instinct told him to retreat into the version of himself that didn't do this. I sign off on your visa sponsorship. I set your salary. If I'd told you how I felt in October, you would never have been able to give me an honest answer, because you'd always wonder if you were saying yes to me, or saying yes to your own job security. I wasn't going to do that to you. So instead you decided, for both of us, that silence was safer. I decided it was fairer. It wasn't fair, Jun-woo. It was just easier for you. She set her bag down, some of the fight going out of her shoulders, replaced by something rawer. Do you know what all those weeks of your careful, honorable distance actually felt like from where I was standing? It felt like nothing, like I'd imagined the whole thing, because a man who genuinely wants someone doesn't disappear the second it might cost him something. I didn't disappear because it might cost me something. I disappeared because it might cost you something. You don't get to decide what it costs me. The words came out louder than she meant them to, sharp in the too quiet kitchen. She caught herself, brought her voice back down. That's the whole point. You keep trying to protect me from a choice that was never yours to make in the first place. They stood there, the distance between them smaller than it had been in months and somehow more absolute. Two people who had finally said the true thing out loud and found it hadn't actually solved anything. The rice cooker clicked over to warm somewhere behind them, an absurdly small sound to interrupt something this large. I care about you, he said, quieter now. More than I've let myself say, to you or to anyone, but I'm not going to ask you to stay. I'm not going to be the reason you turn down Lagos, or the reason you second-guess a future you built for yourself long before you ever met me. I won't do that to you. Even now, even like this. It should have felt like rejection. It didn't, not entirely. She could hear, underneath the restraint, exactly how much the sentence cost him, how it was its own kind of confession. But it also wasn't enough yet, and she needed him to understand why. The date isn't the real issue, Jun-woo. She picked her bag back up, but she didn't move toward the door. I could text Priya and cancel dinner right now, and it wouldn't change anything, because the real issue is that I'm leaving in 10 weeks, and this whole time you have never once told me why that should matter to you. You just told me you don't want me to go. You still haven't told me why. Everything he'd spent months not saying was about to come out, one way or another. He didn't answer right away, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer at all, that he'd retreat, the way he always did, back behind the calm, contained version of himself that closed billion-dollar deals without his pulse ever seeming to change. Instead, he pulled out the chair at the kitchen table, the one that had become his without either of them deciding it, and after a moment, so did she. 6 years ago, I was with someone, Hana. Her name came out carefully, like a word he hadn't used aloud in a long time. She wasn't from my world, and I loved that about her, the same way I love it about you. But I brought her into it anyway, because I wanted her close, and I told myself that was reason enough. She gave up her studio, stopped taking commissions, because it was easier to travel with me than to build something of her own around my schedule. I told myself I was taking care of her. What I was actually doing was letting her disappear a little more every year, until there wasn't much of her left that wasn't built around me. He looked down at the grain of the table, a surface he must have looked at 1,000 times without truly seeing it. By the time she left, she hated who she'd let herself become. I hated that I'd let it happen without noticing. I promised myself I'd never do that to anyone again. I didn't realize that promise could turn into its own kind of harm, held tightly enough, for long enough. Yara sat with that for a long moment, with him and with a woman she'd never met, a sculptor who'd once had a show in Busan and a piece still gathering dust somewhere in his storage because he couldn't bring himself to either display it or let it go. You've been protecting me from becoming her. I've been protecting you from becoming anyone who isn't fully herself. Somewhere in there, I convinced myself that meant I had to disappear too, so I couldn't be the reason you shrank. He finally looked up. I see now, that isn't protection. It's just a different way of taking the choice away from you. Ji-hoon told me as much a month ago. I didn't want to hear it. I have my own version of that fear, she admitted. Not about losing myself in someone else's world. About needing someone enough that I stop trusting my own judgment. My mother did that. Reshaped her whole life around what my father needed, and called it love right up until it wasn't. I promised myself I'd never mistake dependence for love, so when I started feeling this, she gestured, helplessly, at the space between them. Some part of me wanted to run before I found out which one it actually was. I don't need you to decide my future, Jun-woo. I never did. She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, close enough that he could close the distance if he wanted to. I needed the truth, so I could decide it myself. That's all this was ever about. Not you choosing for me. Just you, showing up as an honest option. I don't love the chef who runs my kitchen. His voice had gone rough at the edges, unfamiliar even to himself. I love the woman who corrects my spice levels and calls me a coward when I need to hear it, and turned down 3 job offers before this one, because none of them let her keep her own name on the door. I love who you are outside of anything you do for me, and I am terrified that telling you that now is just another way of making you stay for the wrong reasons. It's not, she said, because I'm still going to Lagos. Something in his face braced, then deliberately released. I know. I'm still taking the offer. I'm still opening that restaurant with my name on the wall. That part isn't negotiable, not even for this. She let the words land, watched him absorb them without the old instinct to retreat. I need you to actually want that for me, not tolerate it. Want it. I do. For the first time in the conversation, it sounded easy, the truest thing he'd said all night. I've spent 3 months trying to work out how to be someone you'd still choose, even from another country. I don't have it fully solved, but I would like the chance to try, if you'll let me. The kitchen had gone quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere below them, the ordinary sound of Seoul at night. Yara looked at the empty chair beside her own, the one she'd started avoiding these last weeks, the one that had come, without either of them naming it, to represent everything she thought she was about to lose. It didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like the beginning of a different shape of the same thing. I have a date tonight, she said again, softer this time, almost amused at herself. I should probably let Priya know I won't be making it. He didn't smile. Not quite. But something in his face came as close as she had ever seen it. I'd like that. Though for the record, I would have respected your right to go. I know you would have. She was already reaching for her phone. That's actually the whole reason I'm staying. She left for Lagos 10 weeks later, and Bae Jun-woo, a man who had once negotiated a hostile takeover without raising his voice, spent the morning of her flight rearranging his calendar 4 separate times so he could be the one to drive her to the airport. At the gate, he didn't say anything grand there either. He just held her for a long moment, the way he seemed to have been wanting to for months, and never once let himself, and said, against her hair, "Text me when you land, even if it's 3 a.m. here." She promised she would. She did. Neither of them mentioned the empty chair waiting back at the penthouse, or how strange it was that leaving him should feel, in its own way, like a kind of homecoming too, toward the life she'd built for herself, the one she was finally allowed to want without guilt. It wasn't a grand gesture, and he'd stopped believing grand gestures meant much of anything. The distance was hard in ways neither of them had fully accounted for, the time difference that meant one of them was always saying good morning while the other said good night, the ordinary ache of an empty apartment on a Tuesday with no one to cook for. But hard wasn't the same as wrong, and neither of them mistook the two. What mattered, he was learning, was smaller and harder to fake. He called instead of assuming. He asked about her week instead of guessing at it from her schedule. When Adun's opening got delayed by a supplier issue and she called him at 2 a.m, furious and exhausted, he didn't offer to fix it with money, though he could have solved it with 1 phone call by sunrise. He listened instead and asked what she actually needed, and she told him, someone to complain to, not someone to rescue her. And he said, simply, understood, and let her finish being angry entirely on her own terms. She built Adun from the ground up over the months that followed, hired her own kitchen staff, argued with contractors, learned to navigate Lagos traffic and Lagos suppliers, and the particular joy of watching a menu she'd designed herself come alive under her own 2 hands. The jollof with suya spice. The pepper soup finished the way her grandmother finished everything. She flew to Seoul when she could. He flew to Lagos more than either of them had expected, folding himself, a little clumsily, and completely willingly, into a city and a kitchen that weren't built around him at all. When Chuseok came around, she flew back to Seoul specifically for it. standing beside him through a full day of ancestral rites and relatives who studied her with open curiosity, and instead of shrinking from their questions, she asked her own right back. About the food, about the songpyeon shaping technique his grandmother insisted only she could teach properly. By the end of the day, his grandmother had adopted her outright, informing Jun-woo in rapid Korean that this one, at least, had sense, an opinion he translated for her later with visible pride. Yara spent the flight back to Lagos trying to explain Songpyeon to Adayase over a crackling video call, and gave up somewhere around, "It's like jollof but for ancestors," which made Adayase laugh so hard she had to mute herself. Adun opened on a humid Lagos evening with a line down the block, and Adayase crying happy, undignified tears in the walk-in fridge where nobody could see her. Yara's name went on the menu exactly the way she'd negotiated it, executive chef and partner, printed in full, and when a food journalist asked, during the opening night rush, who the quiet Korean man at the corner table was, elbow deep in a stack of dishes nobody had asked him to wash, Yara only said, "He's with me." It was, she thought, the truest sentence she'd said all year. At the company's next anniversary dinner, the same event where, a year earlier, a woman had handed Yara an empty glass without looking at her twice, Jun-woo introduced her to the room himself, his hand resting at the small of her back, no hesitation in it at all. "This is Yara," he said, to executives who had once treated her like part of the catering. "She runs Adun, in Lagos, and she's the reason I leave the building before 9 most nights now." He said it simply, like a fact about the weather, and watched, with something close to satisfaction, several months' worth of assumptions rearrange themselves on people's faces at once. Im Ji-hoon, predictably, took full credit. "I believe the phrase you're looking for," he said, the first time he visited Lagos and watched Jun-woo attempt, badly, to help Yara plate a dish for the soft opening, is "thank you, Ji-hoon, for telling me to stop being an idiot." I don't recall it being phrased quite that gently. I'm choosing to remember it more flatteringly with time. Ji-hoon watched Yara laugh at something across the kitchen, watched his friend's entire posture soften just from being near her. "For what it's worth, I knew before you did." "So you've mentioned." Seo Yul knew before either of us. She had a betting pool going with the security team by November. Ji-hoon didn't even try to hide his grin. "You were the last person in that building to find out you were in love with her. It might be a company record." Seo Yul, when Yara mentioned it to her later, only shrugged, entirely unbothered. "I run his calendar. I know exactly how many evenings a man is supposedly working late. The math wasn't difficult." She hesitated, then added quieter. "You should also know," she cried a little, "packing up your things. Don't tell her I told you." Months after that, back in Seoul for a visit, long enough between trips that he'd started counting the days out loud, something he would have found humiliating a year earlier, Yara stood at Jun-woo's kitchen counter the way she had 100 times before, except now he sat at the table without needing an excuse to be there, without pretending he was on his way somewhere else. The rice was hers, the recipe her grandmother's, the bottom layer left deliberately, lovingly burnt. "You're staring," she said, not looking up. "I'm allowed to stare. You're not my employee anymore." "I was never just your employee." "No," he agreed, and reached across the table for her hand, easily, like it was the simplest thing in the world, because by now it was. "You never were." She looked at the chair across from her, his chair now, permanently, the way it had been trying to become for over a year, and thought about her first week in this kitchen, certain she'd be fired within the month for taking up too much space in a life that wasn't hers. She had never stopped taking up space. She had simply, eventually, found someone who wanted her to. Outside, Seoul glittered on, indifferent and enormous, the way it had the night she first told him about a pot of rice and a family who used to fight over the burnt part. He had spent months learning to say what he felt instead of protecting her from it. She had spent months proving that choosing him didn't cost her anything she wasn't willing to give freely. In the end, neither of them had needed saving. They had simply, finally, chosen to stay. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with Yara and Jun-woo's story all the way to the end. If it stayed with you, there's more waiting here whenever you're ready to come back.